Only a few cryptic tweets and a blacked-out event listing that simply stated 8 Mile After Dark were used to market the event. There were no posters, no press run, and no other kind of advertising. At the point when the spectators were aware of what was taking place, the arena had already reached capacity. Although Eminem was back in Detroit, this time it was not for the purpose of making a comeback. To me, it felt like a recollection. When he walked onto the platform, he was dressed in full black, with his hoodie pulled up and his head bowed, so he appeared to be entering a hallowed space. Just a solitary spotlight and a piano riff that shot chills through the crowd were all that was needed. There were no pyrotechnics or ostentatious introductions. People were already yelling, but Eminem remained silent throughout the entire ordeal. As he stood there, his eyes seemed to be searching the crowd for someone or something. He appeared to be looking for something. This wasn't the slimy shady that was popular in the early 2000s when lyrics and fury were everywhere. The bars were still sharp, but they cut differently, like a guy who had seen too much and wasn't afraid to acknowledge it. He was older now, more calculated, and the bars were still sharp. It seemed as though he was unloading portions of himself that no one had ever seen before, and each verse seemed like a burden. As the evening progressed, there was a sense that something was wrong about the environment, but not in a negative way. In between songs, there was a lot less noise. There was a decrease in the number of jokes and shout-outs. On the contrary, Eminem continued to take lengthy pauses, during which he silently gazed out into the crowd of people. It appeared as though he was holding out for the time that was just right, or perhaps for a sign. Next, he began to speak in the gaps between the tracks, speaking rather than performing. The topics that he spoke about were sobriety, his daughter, and the city of Detroit. There was a huddled crowd. There was a problem with the phones. One could tell that folks were aware of it. The event was more than just a concert. It amounted to a confession. Nevertheless, the moment of truth had not yet arrived. It was still accumulating, and it was moving closer and closer to the outskirts of the night like a shadow. Indeed, not even he was aware of its impending arrival. However, in a matter of minutes, a small figure sitting in the front row would completely alter the course of events. This is the kind of moment that would seize the attention of the crowd and not let go of it. They were there to listen to him rap. Instead, they received something that would remain in their memories forever. Despite the fact that the beats were familiar, the sensation was not. There was something about the atmosphere that night that made it feel dense, as if the entire crowd was holding their breath in transition between songs. Even if nobody spoke it out loud, everyone was aware of it. There was more to Eminem's visit than simply performing his classics. He was going through something, and everybody in the audience was right there with him, whether they were aware of it or not. At a slower pace than normal, he performed the song Mockingbird. The song Lose Yourself was given an a cappella verse. Halfway through the performance of Not Afraid, he literally stopped what he was doing and simply looked into the crowd. It was a silence. To be respectful, but not completely silent. It was as if everyone had a natural understanding that they should not disrupt whatever was going on within his thoughts. Not only did the security guards appear to be anxious, but they also appeared to be searching the floor, as if they too were anticipating the arrival of something. Although some fans joked that it was like going to church, some speculated that he might be retiring. Many who were more knowledgeable understood it for what it actually was. That was not the conclusion. This was the starting point. There is a change. And it had already begun to go forward. A minor ruckus started to flare up in the vicinity of the front. However, it was loud enough to cause a few heads to turn, but not loud enough to raise concern. One of the signs was being held up by a young girl who couldn't have been older than 7 years old. Some of the marks were blurred along the borders, but there was one line that was unmistakable. If you are Eminem, do you have faith in Jesus? In the beginning, many around her laughed, but it was more out of astonishment than out of mockery. It was not the kind of environment where you would anticipate being asked a question of that nature. Her expression, on the other hand, was earnest, curious, and not forceful. She wasn't trying to make a statement. Rather, she was simply curious about the matter. Moreover, Eminem was able to see it in spite of the lights, the noise, and the pandemonium that was going on around him. There was a tiny tilt to his head. This was captured by the camera feed. One moment he was rapping, and the next, he was no longer doing so, without a doubt. After that, the music stopped. There was a void in the audience. Then, He gave a single nod, made a comment to the security personnel who were nearby, and pointed in her direction. Within a matter of moments, the girl and her father were being gently guided to the edge of the stage, and the entire night took a dramatic turn towards something that nobody saw coming. No one anticipated what was going to happen next, because it was unexpected. During the show, a young girl approached Eminem with a question about Jesus. The audience was stunned into silence by his astounding response. It was one of those odd times in which time seemed to stretch out just a little bit, causing everyone to become extraordinarily attentive. It was no longer playing music. The focus switched completely, and there, beneath the overwhelming illumination of the stage, was a young girl of 7 years old, being delicately carried by security personnel and assisted in standing next to Eminem. When compared to him, she appeared to be quite small. She was wearing an oversized hoodie, she was wearing pink sneakers, and she was still holding the handmade sign in her hand. Her father remained on the stage's edge, observing with a smile that was an expression of both nervousness and pride. As Eminem crouched down, he continued to hold the microphone in his hand. He began speaking to her without using any form of amplification. It was a quiet conversation that no one else could hear. Then, in a measured manner, he lifted the microphone and inquired, "Do you have a question for me?" The young girl gave a slight nod. She moved closer to the microphone, her voice shaking slightly, but still being audible enough to be heard over the silence. "Have you put your faith in Jesus?" You might have been able to hear a pin drop. There was no movement at all. Not a single person laughed. This was not some kind of internet joke. A child asked an honest inquiry to a man who was known for his fury, disobedience, and rhymes. There was no punchline. It was just an honest query. The expression on Eminem's face was one of genuine hesitation, showing that he was neither insulted nor caught off guard. With a slow exhalation, he slowly rose back up and looked around the arena as if he was trying to find the appropriate words to express himself. The throng waited in anticipation, and Eminem was well aware of the fact that this was not the kind of question that could be answered with a lyric or a remark. After walking to the edge of the stage and starting to pace a little, he returned to the stage and kneeled down next to her once more. He inquired, "You really want to know?" And she gave a single nod in response. The events that transpired after that were not rehearsed. They were not polished or polished. They were raw. They were real. But they had not yet occurred. It was clear to him that anything he was going to say would be remembered for a much longer period of time than any poem he dropped that night. He turned his gaze back to the crowd, which consisted of thousands of faces all waiting for what he would say next. And just like that, Eminem stood erect once more, holding a microphone in his hand, and at long last started telling his story. Despite the fact that it weighed 100 pounds, Eminem held the microphone tightly. When he suddenly had no hurry to say, it was surprising because he was a man who could spout poetry faster than most people could think. Everyone was able to sense that the inquiry asked by the young girl, which was pure and uncomplicated, had opened the door to something more profound. There was one more time that he looked down at her, and then he looked out over the sea of faces that were silent. Finally, he added, "I've been asked a lot of things in my life, but I ain't never been asked that in front of this many people." He was referring to the actual question. Some people in the crowd laughed uneasily, while others remained still and seated. He proceeded by saying, "I grew up in a place where faith was not easy to come by. It was a place where you prayed not because you believed someone was listening to you, but because it was the only thing you could do." At this point, he was not rapping. Rather, he was simply talking and confessing, and the impact was different. He told me that I used to believe that if there was a God, he would despise me. If things were different, why would they be the way they were? Why would I make such a significant loss? Friends, family, and I are all included. You were able to see him attempting to maintain his composure. Despite the fact that his eyes were wet, his speech was steady. "I don't know, dude." He hesitated, and I finished cleaning up. And then, somewhere along the way, I became clean. It was a second chance for me. My kid began to look at me as if I were someone who was worthy of believing in. And it was at that moment that I began to seriously consider the possibility that someone was watching out for me, even when I wasn't looking myself in the eye. The young lady remained motionless and silent while she listened to him. She did not squirm in any way. He stated that he did not possess all of the answers, but definitely, I believe. Perhaps not in the manner that others anticipate me to, but I do. After that, he smiled at her, looked down at her, and continued, "Thank you for asking me something that is completely genuine." The audience erupted in cheers rather than shrieking in response to the news. The applause was tremendous, long and sluggish. It seemed as though people needed some time to digest what they had just seen. The kind of viral moment that fans came to record was not this one. Rather, it was something else entirely, something that is private. And for the first time in a very long time, it appeared as though Eminem was not merely performing, rather, he was participating in the event. After the ovation had subsided into a low hum, Eminem returned his attention to the microphone, as if he had not yet completed his performance. Currently, the young lady was positioned at the edge of the platform, with her father standing close. She continued to hold her sign and continue to watch him, as if he were the only person in the entire world. For a moment, Eminem inhaled deeply. "I used to believe that faith was something that was reserved for individuals who were in need of assistance," he added. "As if you were strong, you didn't require all of that. On the other hand, truth be told, I was completely wrong because I was drowning without even being aware of it." He looked across the crowd, thousands of eyes fixed on him, and at that moment, there was no beat, no bass line, just words. He continued by saying that there were times when I should have died, including overdoses, blackouts, and wrath. Moreover, each time I emerged on the other side, I reminded myself that I had been fortunate. But now, I'm not so confident that it was solely a matter of luck. The gathering was very silent, and it seemed as though every word he said was chipping away at some wall. People were unaware that they should have been paying attention. I began praying once more once I had cleaned up my life. But this time, I did not pray aloud or in front of other people. Rather, I prayed in the shadows, whispering, as if I were afraid that someone would hear me. Perhaps someone did it, as it turns out. He didn't try to hide the fact that his voice was cracking in that final statement. It was only for a moment. Following that, he turned his attention back to the young girl and stated, "I'm not a preacher. I'm not perfect. I still make mistakes more often than I'd like to admit. I do believe that there is something that is greater than me, something that is greater than all of this." And after that, he did something that nobody had anticipated. He leaned down once again, softly caressed the edge of her sign, and then spoke into the microphone, saying, "You reminded me why I do this, why I'm still standing here, so thank you." The audience rose in unison, and there were no violent yells. Rather, there was a standing ovation. People applauded, some of them shed tears, and others simply stood there motionless, unsure of how to respond to a moment that was so unvarnished and genuine. Following a period of time, the music was heard again, but it was not the same. It was a moment that remained. The way it lingered in the air was dense and impossible to ignore. It was like smoke. There was a change in the atmosphere of the room, and the night had not yet come to an end. The remaining portion of the concert was like to a dream. It was gentle around the edges and quieter than it had been at the beginning. Immediately following that interaction with the young girl, Eminem did not say much more. He allowed the music to speak unapologetically. Just a quiet walk off stage and a single wave goodbye. There will be no grandiose encore, no pyrotechnics, and no fireworks. There was no media frenzy or a public relations staff that was scrambling to spin the occasion behind the scenes. On social media, it was scarcely noticeable. There were a few shaky clips and a handful of posts from admirers who were present. In truth, it was barely a blip. Nevertheless, because it lacked context, it did not immediately become viral on the internet like other famous moments typically do. But perhaps that was a fortunate turn of events, because there was something about that moment that was not intended to go viral. Neither was it intended to be a headline, nor was it intended to be liked. Simply put, it was too human and too honest for that. In the later hours of that evening, when the arena was being cleared out and the cleaning team began to sweep up confetti and plastic cups, the young girl and her father silently exited the arena, going unobserved by the majority of the audience. She was still holding the sign in her hand, and while other people were discussing the set list, the merchandise, or whether or not he would tour again, she simply smiled and murmured to her father, "He answered me about the tour." So that was sufficient. The following day, Eminem did not post anything about it. Neither interviews nor follow-ups were conducted, nor were there any exclusive tell-all videos. There is only quiet. Moreover, something significant lingered in the midst of that quiet. Not the kind that is popular at the moment, but the kind that persists in your mind. Not because it was loud or shocking, but because those who were present would remember it. They would remember it. On account of the fact that, for once, it seemed as though they were not seeing a performance. They would remember it. They were observing a person who was open, flawed, and still trying to figure out who they were. After a brief pause, the lights on the stage were turned down, and the arena went completely dark. On the other hand, something remained lit for those individuals who had actually listened to what was spoken that evening. And it's possible that this is also what it was all about the whole time. Do you have any thoughts? Did this happen to be a rare and peaceful moment between a music icon and a child of the same age? Then again, did anything more significant take place on that platform that evening?